Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Robert Mixon. Now, Robert was a major general in the US Army, had a 30 plus year career there, very successful career in the US Army. Left that and became involved in for-profit and non-profit organizations at a very senior level. And in 2014, he set up his own consulting business, Level 5 Associates, which is really focusing on strategy and operations in businesses. So very experienced, very experienced man, and is now based himself in sunny Florida. But what we talk about is he's an author of a couple of books. We talk about his most recent book is Who Saw This Coming? Now What Do We Do? Which I think is a great title and very relevant for our current circumstances. But, we talk about, the challenge with the changing workplace and the changing work environment of how do we create that all-in culture that we need to have. But we also talk about the six big principles that he refers to that are just so fundamentally important to every leader, and we go through a number of those. Robert is a really experienced leader of people, and I think that shows through so strongly in the way he talks about it and his commitment to that. So I really encourage you to listen to this, because there's a lot of good content and good practical stuff that you can take away. So sit back and enjoy the very interesting Robert Mixon. Robert, thank you so much indeed for joining us here on the Winning Teams podcast. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Well, thanks, John. I'm glad to be here and be part of the conversation on, what does it take to build winning teams?
Absolutely. Well, listen, it'll be a good conversation. Maybe before we get into it, I think it'd be really helpful to the audience just to get a little bit of your background, and because I know you've got a very extensive Army background and then commercial and an entrepreneurial background. So maybe share that with everybody so that they know where you're coming from.
Sure, John. I grew up the oldest of six children in Georgia and North Carolina. Didn't have a lot other than a lot of love between us, and was fortunate enough to in high school to be good enough as an athlete and a student to get the opportunity to go to West Point in July of 1970. So as a 17-year-old kid, I moved to New York, a place I'd never really been, and went through what I call a crucible experience of 4 years at West Point, with all that goes with that disciplined, rigorous environment. But I met a group of men, it was all male at that time, which really became my band of brothers. And through the rest of my journey in the military, which initially started out as a 5-year journey, turned into a 33-year journey. I don't know exactly how that happened, except it just sort of happened in terms of the way it fell out. I was privileged to command soldiers at a number of levels up to division installation level, and then left the Army when it was my time and went into the corporate world and was president of a manufacturing company, executive vice president of a nonprofit and a manufacturing company. We built a program for veterans called Warrior Salute for veterans with traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, a community-based program to augment what the Veterans Administration was doing because the need was so great. And then in 2014, started my own company, Level 5 Associates, where I sought to help individuals and leaders grow leaders who get it and not make the same mistakes I had made over the course of my career. I don't know how successful I've been, but I've certainly had a lot of fun doing it. And I've met a lot of great men and women who are working diligently to lead people the way they deserve to be led.
Yeah. So just curious when you're talking about it. I mean, I can only imagine what it must have been like for a 17-year-old kid to actually, move from where you moved to New York to start that. What did you learn about yourself? Because it must have been, like going to a different planet.
It certainly was. In the summer of 1970, America was in turmoil. In many ways, like it is today, but in a little different context. We were starting to come out of the Vietnam War, which had been a very disappointing experience for most Americans. And certainly the ones who had served so ably were not received by the rest of Americans the way they deserved to be. And that tension in America among those who were serving and supporting the war and those who were adamantly opposing the war was manifested in the summer of 1970 by events like the shootings at Kent State and the trial and the My Lai massacre of Lieutenant Calley. And so I went into a military environment where my generation in the early 1970s was torn as the nation was torn in terms of supporting the military. And then I was exposed to a culture of compliance, of discipline, of rigor, very little room for forgiveness. And it was, tough for a teenager to do any of that kind of stuff. But in the West Point environment and the culture we were in as a nation, we tended to become, I think, somewhat isolated by that, the world around us. And we only had few opportunities to go out and interact with our peers in society. But I would say that it was formative for me because I learned inside myself that I had the ability to be resilient if I had battle buddies around me who could support that resilience, that team of teams concept that General Stan McChrystal talks about in his book. That really came to life for me in those formative years.
Yeah, because going back to that time, and I mean, it was an extraordinary time, wasn't it? I mean, with the whole disaffection post the Vietnam War and where people, stood in regard to their opinions about that. But I mean, but I say, it must have been such an incredibly formative time for you as a very young man going into that environment. But I mean, you since setting up Level 5 Associates, and you've authored a number of books, and the most recent one was Who Saw This Coming Now? What Do We Do? You probably could apply that to 1970 as well, couldn't you?
I think so. I think so, John. We saw the perfect storm a couple of years ago in America. It wasn't the first perfect storm,
no,
but to many of us, we thought so. And our ability to adapt to the environment of extreme social distress, of a disease we didn't know how to counter, in a world that was, I say the entire world was immersed in this disease environment, had to respond to it. And we had to figure out, okay, how do we survive? How do we adapt and survive? And that, I think that was a significant part of overcoming the fear factor, which gripped much of America 2 years ago.
Absolutely. And, I mean, we've been talking about, for years, we've been talking about the way of working is changing, and with AI and everything else coming into it, and with people on remote working, and then suddenly COVID hit and bang, we're in the middle of it, kind of almost overnight. And I think that one of the things that you talk about in the book, which I thought was really interesting, was that, one of the challenges in what you refer to as this kind of all-in culture, which organizations want to have, it is a challenge to do in the remote world of working, isn't it?
It certainly is, because without the face-to-face interaction, which we have become so associated with, we have to learn to live in more of a virtual world. In the virtual world, communication is more difficult. It has to be more deliberate. And I think that now that we've moved into more of a hybrid world where you have some people in person and some people virtual, the leadership challenges are even greater. But as I talk about in the book, the big 6 principles, which aren't rocket science, were applicable in the live world, if you will. They were applicable in the virtual world, and they're applicable in the hybrid world. It's just up to us as leaders to be adaptive, and take those principles and apply them to the world we're in, not the world we may want it to be. We can't go back in time and create the world we want it to be. I hear people talk about going back to normal. I don't know what normal is. I think normal is what it is today, not what it was.
Yeah, exactly. And that normal is evolving as we speak. There's no doubt about that. Just curious when you're talking about that, and I want to talk about the big 6 because I think that they're very powerful. in the impact that they can have. But when you look at the, what coming out of COVID, and we're still coming out of COVID, whatever that means. Yeah. But if you look at that, I mean, you talk the great talk about, the great resignation, and that's not just hype. That's real. That is happening. For leaders, how do leaders and must leaders respond? Because it has just changed. We've seen people at very senior level in some very large organizations that would have been almost immovable a number of years ago, and are movable. And how do leaders need to adopt their own leadership style and approach to really combat against that great resignation?
Well, first and foremost, I think leaders need to be genuine. The demand for us to be genuine, to be authentic, is greater than it's ever been. You can't have a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type of persona. You've got to be the real deal. So first, I would suggest to leaders that they examine who they are and what they represent. Write a personal mission statement. Write a personal leadership philosophy. Describe who you are and what you represent, and share that with your leadership team. Particularly, I think it's most effective when you share it with them one-on-one where possible. But, I would say from the baseline, start there. And whether it's virtual or live, that expression of your genuine persona as a leader is going to set the conditions for a higher level of communication. Then you can begin to apply the Big Six principles in yourself and in your teams. When people have developed their mission and their philosophies and shared them with each other, now you've created a greater sense of alignment.
And, it's interesting when you talk about the six principles, and so I do want to dig into that. But I mean, in a sense, and you've said it yourself, I mean, it's not rocket science. Yep. And it's not, neither is it complex. That doesn't mean it's simple, but it doesn't happen. I mean, if we talk about, let's just kind of go through a couple of them here, but you talk about, kind of setting your azimuth, as you refer to it, which is really your mission and intent. Yes. I mean, you say, well, okay, well, I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? But it doesn't always happen, does it?
It does not. Setting your azimuth, establishing your mission, your intent, which I think is a more deliberate form of vision, your values and your culture, your behaviors represent your values. That's really square one. But in many organizations, they don't do it. They don't do it because they say they don't have time to do it. Well, I'm not sure you'd have time not to do it. You got to set your azimuth first and do it collectively as a team where, we own it. If you set it yourself, then you own it. Nobody else does. The second principle is listen.
Yeah. Before you go to the listen one, can I bring it back? Because one of the things I thought, and it's so powerful what you said in it, and it applies to lots of things, but particularly when setting your azimuth, or I think also in terms of values, is that very often you see organizations, I mean, they bring people like me or you in to kind of say, okay, we want to do work and we want to set our values, right? And you go through the whole exercise and it's kind of tick the box. We've done that, right? Now we move on to the next thing, right? But the point that you're making is that you've got to repeat the story of the azimuth. You've got to repeat it 700 times, whatever it might be, but you've just got to keep on repeating. And that's the bit that's missed.
Yeah, they say that if you want to have someone receive a message, you have to tell them 7 times. I think it's more like 70, John, or as you allude to, 700. The azimuth should be the drumbeat of your organization. And that message has to be sent and received repeatedly in order to stick. So the azimuth is the core element of our organization. You've got to set it, and then you got to reinforce it. You can't set it and forget it like the old commercial says. You have to set it and sustain it. One of the elements that I see frequently is people write down or describe their values, but they don't describe the behaviors.
Yes.
The culture that goes along with those values. Let me give you an example. Many organizations really love the value of respect, which they define as regard for others. You need to define your values. So they define it as regard for others. But I say, well, what behaviors do you manifest to demonstrate respect in your organization? I say, well, we treat people, as they would like to be treated. I said, okay, that's good. I like that. Well, how about in terms of your culture, you describe that we do things on time. When you do things on time, do you demonstrate respect? Absolutely. But most of us don't realize that. And so I probably have 7,000 hours of my life that are gone. I can't recoup them because I spent them on wasted meetings that didn't start on time and didn't end on time and didn't have an agenda, didn't have any deliverables. And yet the organization said, oh, we have respect. That's one of our values. I said, well, do you do things on time? Well, no, not really. Well, then how do you demonstrate respect?
Yeah.
So that's an example, John, that
I think, yeah, I think that it's so important that people understand, because, we can put up words like respect or integrity and, all those sort of things. And I would say, yeah. No, I get that. And I said, okay, so what do we mean by it in this organization? What behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not acceptable, right?
Correct.
And I do think you've got to get down to that behavior level. I think that's really important. The second one that you talk about is listening, which is about seeking to understand. And you quote Stephen Covey in that. But one of the things that you talk about, and I thought this was a very neat little thing, you talk about what you refer to as the back brief to make it even more effective. You might share what you mean by that and how that works.
Well, the back brief is really a confirmation of receiving a message. When I was a young lieutenant, got an officer out in patrolling the east-west German border, I had 10 armored vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers. And I would call them together in my group as a 22-year-old young lieutenant who supposedly knew what he was doing. And I would say, okay, we got a mission to go over here and occupy this battle position near the border, where the Soviet forces are. And we have to do it by 10 o'clock tonight. And so we're going to go north and then we're going to occupy and orient east. And I said, okay, everybody got that? And they all, yes, sir, we got it. And then they'd all get in their tanks in the woods there and head out in different directions. Well, I can tell you it's very difficult to stop a tank in the dark in the woods. And they all had some idea where north was and east was and all that. But since I didn't get a back brief to confirm that they had heard what I said, they made up their own idea of what they thought I said, and they went out and did what they thought was right. So that happens in organizations all the time. In fact, I'd still probably have tanks and carriers wandering around the German forest if they hadn't run out of fuel. So, that happens in organizations daily, where we don't confirm that, I heard what you think you said in the way you intended to transmit it. So we use the back brief as a tool, or to say, in a group of people, even two people, say, all right, Robert, how about back briefing me on what you heard that I said? And then we can realize that we both have a common view of what needs to be done. That really is a challenge for most organizations and most leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to go through all six, but I just wanted to jump into the one of the you talk about. I mean, the second one is listening, and I think that's very powerful in terms of the whole thing about the back brief. I think that's really important. But trust and empowerment is your third one, right. And you talk about this kind of horizontal accountability or mutual accountability. And I absolutely agree with you. I suppose my question in my own head is that, but you don't see it very often.
Mm-mm. You don't see it enough. The special operations are probably the finest example, special operations forces in most militaries, including the US, because they have an accountability of each other that really is based upon a mantra that I will not fail those with whom I serve. In most organizations, they don't share that level of commitment because they don't work at it hard enough, in my view. I'll give you an example. When teams are assembled, I highly recommend that they develop a team covenant, that they agree to a set of commitments to each other in this covenant, and that they all sign it, because your signature indicates your level of commitment. Now you have a tool for mutual accountability within that team. You've established the covenant, you've signed it, and now you hold each other accountable to it. You don't need of anybody above you or below you, although they will hold you accountable. I think within that team, you've established a framework of accountability. And that's the type of mutual accountability I'm talking about.
Why? I'm just curious, from the work that you've done, I mean, and your experience in the Army, why do you think there is such a reluctance to hold each other accountable? Is it is it because I don't want to upset somebody? Or is it that, well, if I do it, then somebody's going to hold me accountable? Why do you think it is?
Well, part of it is because we don't establish that personal mission and philosophy and share it with each other. So we haven't committed to each other as to who we are as individuals. I think that precedes the mutual accountability. When you establish that commitment, then you can hold each other accountable. The second component is we don't establish the ground rules of how the team operates in that covenant. So we don't have psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson talks about, the Harvard professor. We don't have psychological safety, so people don't feel safe to call each other out, to challenge the existing ideas, to go beyond groupthink. And as a result, the fear factor, as I mentioned earlier about COVID, the fear factor sets into team dynamics, and accountability, mutual accountability doesn't happen.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Your sixth principle is about balance, and that really is about taking ownership of your time and how you spend it. Maybe just elaborate on that, what you meant by that.
Well, balance, in many cases, people think it's work life. It's how many hours you spend at work and how many hours you spend with family. I don't believe that's true. I hate that term as well. I must say, I hate when I hear people say work life. It's as if work and life are separate. Yeah, as if we have some on-off switch. Yeah. You know, I don't have an off switch. I don't think. I mean, I can't go sit in front of the NCAA playoffs without getting. I do get excited, but I don't have an off switch. So I'm still thinking about the Big Six or organizations, people I'm working with, and their challenges. You know, at 9 o'clock at night or whatever. And so I don't think we should consider ourselves being out of balance if that's the case. I think we should consider ourselves out of balance if we don't sustain our energy levels. Balance is not about time. Balance is about energy. We have 4 energy levels in us: the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual. If we don't sustain those batteries, then we're out of balance. And if we don't sustain those energy levels in our team members, they become out of balance. We all become out of kilter. And nothing good results of that. We end up with burnout. We end up with apathy. You know, to go back to psychological safety that Amy Edmondson talks about. We end up in the zone of apathy. Yeah. Or in the zone of anxiety. We never reside in the learning zone where she says the healthiest teams reside. And that's a balance issue. We don't pay attention to balance. And as a result, we suffer. Our efficiency suffers. Our cohesion suffers.
Yeah, and it ain't 50-50. That's for sure.
It's not. I don't know where we got that from. I don't know. Somebody developed a formula at some point in time, but that's not where it is. I mean, that's not where it resides. And again, we can't go back to time, John. It's not about. People say, "Well, we're gonna do time management." Well, you can't manage time. Time is finite. Yeah. So you can take more ownership of the time you have if you're deliberate about it. If you have some thoughtful input to where you spend your time. Which I think you spend your time according to the values that exist, and you believe it.
I agree, because very often we're starting work with a client and they say, "Oh, I have a problem with time management." I always think, no, you don't actually have a problem with time management, because time just is. You don't manage it; it just is, right? Yeah. And it's yourself that you have a problem with, not time management. So I think it is. But I love the book. I mean, it's a great read. It's a short read. Who saw this coming? Thanks. I think it's a great title. Now, what do we do? And I think that it's a really good kind of manual for people to kind of pick up and say, okay, if I really think about those 6 principles, I can do something about those today, and I can implement them, and they will make a difference. So I think it's great. Before I ask you just kind of where people can get in touch with you, Robert, just 2 questions that I ask everybody. One is a book other than your own, and that's made an impact upon you. What's the book, and what was the impact?
Well, my favorite book is that worked for me in my life and leadership by General Colin Powell. It was his second book. My American Journey was his first, but his second book is really a wonderful set of stories that he tells about his life and his journey. I had the privilege of working for him when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a period of time, and being in his personal circle was an extraordinary privilege. But that notwithstanding, I think the book has a wonderful set of messages for all of us. And it sort of takes one of the greatest men in history and puts him into context as a real person. And that's why it's my favorite.
Yeah, he's a truly great man, wasn't he? He really was. I mean, fantastic man.
We miss him terribly.
Yeah, and with the most amazing integrity.
Yes.
And he really does stand tall in that sense. Second question is daily rituals. Successful people I know, they've daily rituals. They have different daily rituals. I'm just curious what yours are and how they serve you.
Well, there are several that serve me well. One of them I learned the hard way. In fact, I learned all of them by screwing them up. But one of them is that I think you'd have to have sleep discipline. In the Army, that was not a popular term. We used sleep deprivation as our mantra. And you found out that your performance fell off very rapidly when you weren't at rest. 2/3 of Americans don't get enough sleep, and they're sleep deprived, and their quality of life suffers accordingly. So I follow a sleep discipline. The second ritual that I believe in is the daily audit. Every day, I spend 10 to 15 minutes auditing myself at the end of the day. And I ask myself 3 questions. One is, what did you do today to help others grow? Secondly, what did you plan to do today to help others grow? And third, what are you going to do tomorrow to fill in the gaps between what you had planned to do and what you actually did to help others grow? And that others includes yourself, because the first person you have to lead is you. Yeah. But the daily audit, I used to even put it on my calendar for a long time until it became a habit. I did it more than 21 times. But I talked to leaders of all walks of life, and I advise them strongly to take on the daily audit as a habit that will serve you well.
I think that is fantastic. I love that. I really do. I think that is an extraordinary one. Just out of curiosity, when you say about sleep, do you believe that you should have a sleep for a certain number of hours every night? Is that what you mean by that?
I do, and you should prepare and protect that. I don't, if you want to put on your pajamas and slippers, that's fine. But I think that most of us have a band of sleep that helps us be healthy. For some people, it's 5, 6 hours. Some people 7 or 8. Mine is about 7, and I have to make the time to do that. And when I don't do that, when I don't meet that 7-hour framework, my attitude and performance suffers accordingly. Yeah. So I coach leaders to do that because I think it matters. It's one of those elements of balance that has a huge return on investment.
Out of curiosity, how do you determine what the number of hours are the right number of hours for the individual?
I think there's a couple of ways. Scientifically, I think there are, medical advice you could get on what sleep patterns you have. You can even go through a sleep study. And I have done that on occasion where, you actually wear a monitor and you go to sleep, and it determines your patterns of when you're in what they call REM sleep and all that. Of course, this is way beyond my competence, but I'm just talking about in a macro sense. The other one is you can follow your pattern for a week and just keep a log of how much you sleep at night for a period of a week to 2 weeks, and determine where the mean is or where you felt the best the next day. That's not very scientific, but although it's anecdotal, I think it would give you a baseline to operate.
All right, interesting. But I love your daily audit. I think that is really very, very powerful.
Thanks,
Robert. It's been fantastic to talk to you. Where can people reach out and find you and get in touch with you?
Yeah, I certainly enjoy that. My website is www.level5associates.com. That's my company. You spell out the 5, level5associates.com. My email address is robert@level5associates.com. So you can reach me through the website, or you can reach me directly on the website, or the blogs that I have written every other week for several years now, references to the books, and what I do and what I can provide if you're interested in exploring some opportunities together.
That is fantastic. Robert, it's been a real pleasure and honor to have you. Thank you so much for your time. I know that you've given a lot of great wisdom to the listeners. I really appreciate you doing that today.
Thanks, John. It was great talking with you, and I certainly wish you and your teams well.
Thank you.